So, key books. Usually it's about one book, maybe two books. Well, so far, no, there's been two episodes. One was about one book, one was about two books. This is the third episode, and it's about three books. I promise it will not keep going this way, but who keep talking to me about understanding navies in the 1920s and 30s and how you sort of do it and whether there are any books that you can approach for that one. And I looked through my collection, I sort of went, well, there are roughly three books which are good starting points. For Britain, it's Andrew Field's Royal Navy Strategy in the Far East, 1919 to 1939. I don't agree with everything in it, but it's one of the best research books on this subject out there. And most of the stuff I don't agree with Andrew on. I would say it's a choice, it's a matter of perspective and how we weight various factors than anything that is a serious cause of alarm or debate or, disagreement. It's more of a cause of, we could have a very nice luncheon discussing this and debating, rather than than the sort of disagreements which means you can't be in the same room or something like that. To Train for the Fleet for War by Albert Nuffy, which is all about the US Navy fleet problems 1923 to 1940 and how these evolve, and it's a really good source for that. So basically, one gives you the Royal Navy, this is the US Navy, so you can guess which the third one's going on. This is Sunburst by Mark Peedy. And it's the rise of Japanese naval air power, 1909 to 1941. Now, there are other options. There are all sorts of other options of books I could have gone with, but I chose not to. Why? Because these three are some of the best which are to approach if you're starting off. So whilst something like Kaigan might be probably one of the best books of all time to go and look at if you want to learn about the Imperial Japanese Navy and its progress and development between 1887 and 1941, and it's all its strategy, tactics, and everything that goes onto it. As good as this book is, it's not the first book you want to read on the subject if you've never read anything on it before. It just isn't. Because it, to an extent, expects a certain level of knowledge before you read it. It does expect a certain level of knowledge before you read it. All these three books, and the reason I've put them in my key books for this, is that they don't presume you have knowledge. PT does an excellent job of this in this book. No Fee, I'm not even sure if it was intentional, but it is absolutely a great book for someone to read for the first time. And why do I say it's not intentional? It's because it comes across so naturally. I think it's probably just the way that No Fee thinks. Of Andrew Field, well, this one is, he knows very few people have read any books or have read anything which discussed Royal Navy strategy in the Far East. And so he knows he's starting from a blank slate, so he explains everything as he goes because that's what you have to do. And that's why I have picked them. Because for three books, which if someone's wanting to go, okay, I want to start off by understanding this era, and I want to understand what's going on, the three biggest navies in terms of what they're doing, what they're thinking, is a good place to start. And therefore, these are three good books to start off going. And it basically, if you already understand the American side, because you already studied it, then you might want the Japanese on the British side to start off with, so you can understand what they were doing. If you understand the British one, you can. American and French, American and Japanese are perfectly well to pick up. There is a good French one as well coming. But that's not out yet. I know it's coming. I've been hearing about it on the grapevine for ages. But I know it's not come yet, but it's coming. And I'm always on the lookout for the Italian one, because I would love to be able to redo this video someday with the 5 books for that period. And yes, the requirement for me to redo that video is that they all must be in English language. Because basically the idea, most of my audience are English speaking, and the idea is that, yeah, these are all sources in English language for you to go and look at. I will say this also on these books. I've selected them all, not just because they're easy to read, they are easy to access, not necessarily easy to read, but easy to access. But also because all three of them, I would say, speak to me. Again, I don't agree with everything in them. I really don't. But I'm a historian. We never agree with anything everyone else has written. But I do agree with all three of these that they are very well researched and they have got a lot of information in them. And that is why it's so worthwhile and why I'm doing this video. So with that all in mind, let's start off with, well, I did just mention Kaigan, so I should probably start off with Sunburst, shouldn't I? I shouldn't start, to discuss the Japanese and then not start off with a Japanese example. And also this does mean I can put my credit card and debit card back. Again, yes, I will. It's become such a thing in this theory, such a tradition so far already in these videos that I use the cards from my wallet rather than bookmarks. But I should use bookmarks. I'll get some bookmarks. Japanese naval air power on the eve of the Pacific War. Now, this is a really good section for this book. Whilst the Japanese Navy did not, at the onset of the Pacific War, have at hand the strategic air force that Admiral Inoue would have wished, by the late autumn of 1941, the Japanese naval air arm constituted the most potent offensive force of any of the three major navies. By the first week in December 1941, this naval air power was deployed in deadly array. There were over 3,000 aircraft operational reserve in the Navy. I would say on the potency front, I would say certainly they were one of the most largest, most flexible, but I think the trouble is we're using the word potency. To me, that means they are all dominant, all conquering. And they weren't. All the naval air services have different advantages. It depends on the air service, which one you're talking about, where their advantage lies. But, yeah, they're there. They're there, and they exist. I'll do that a bit. Yeah. There were over 3,000 aircraft, operational reserve in the Navy. Of these, over about 1,800 were combat planes that were among the world's finest, and could, with imported exceptions, fly faster and further than generally outperformed their American counterparts. It says farther, I have to admit, in the book. It should be further, I think. I would say it should be further, but okay. The crews manning these aircraft were resolute, intelligent, highly motivated, rigorously trained, and to a substantial degree, blooded in war. The Navy's 37 land-based air groups were distributed at bases deployed from the Kuriles to the French Indochina to Marshall Islands. On paper, the Japanese carrier forces were superior to either the US or the British. 10 Japanese carriers, counting Hosho, to the American 6. The Hornet was working up, but not yet operational. Certainly, they were better organised for working together. This I cannot disagree with at this point, because whilst both the US Navy and the Royal Navy had been doing multi-carrier doctrine in the interwar periods, by this point, by 1941, the Royal Navy carriers were because of the decision where they hadn't carried on, they paused the procurement in 1939. They hadn't carried on building them, so they hadn't had enough to be able to do multi-carrier operations. The good example is during the early Mediterranean, you have a lot of HMS Eagle and HMS Illustrious working together as a multi-carrier force. And I know 2 carriers might not seem like a multi-carrier force, but when you're considering how many carriers British have, how many theatres they need to carry, putting 2 together shows the importance of the theatre. But the fact is, again, things like Taranto don't happen because Eagle's damaged and needs to be repaired. And so that's why it's a single carrier operation. And these things build up. And that's why the British are operating singly. The Americans are similarly spread out around the world, so they're all forced to operate singly. And the Japanese are able to concentrate in a way the others aren't. The Navy's greatest single concentration of air power, were over 350 dive bombers, attack bombers, and Zero fighters, was embarked on the 6 carriers of the Hawaii Strike Force, steaming towards the waters northwest of Oahu. From there it would launch the thunderbolt that would change the course of naval history. I enjoy this book, but I do admit it does have, for me, as a historian, I would say, whilst I don't agree with passive voice all the time being used for phraseology, sometimes you can get swept up. And I think I think Mark Peaty does get swept up in this point and is going, yes, this is high energy, so I'm going to give things like Thunderbolt. In Southeast Asia, because the operation against the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor used all of Japan's largest carriers, the Navy was obliged to rely on land-based air power and 3 small carriers to spearhead its projected offensive. To these were added the 526 aircraft of the 21st and 23rd Air Flotillas of the 11th Air Fleet, operating from several bases on Taiwan and poised to eliminate American air power in the Philippines for the Army's invasion of the islands. Their G3M and G4M bombers were to attack and destroy the bomber base at... They have a few good pages of maps and descriptions here, nice tables that goes through, and the maps especially are interesting and useful, sort of where things are positioned. Clarke Field and the small auxiliary field at Aba, on the coast of the west of Clarke, which at the last moment was substituted for the fighter base at Nicholas Field. 90 Zero fighters, constituting most of the Zeros not embarked on the 6 carriers of the Hawaii Strike Force, were to race out ahead across the China Sea to eliminate any enemy aircraft in northern Luzon and to strafe enemy ground targets there. To enable them to make this operation of unprecedented distance for fighter aircraft, the already phenomenal range of the Zero had been extended by various adjustments to engine and propeller speeds and the fuel mixtures. From Paola in the West Carolina Islands, the Ryujo, escorting a small convoy, pushed westward to cover the Japanese landings on Legapasi, on the tip of the southeastern Luzon. Much further to the west, G3M and G4M bombers of the 22nd Air Flotilla of the 11th Air Fleet, along with a handful of Zeros, lifting off from various bases in Japanese-occupied French China, began to patrol the South China Sea as flank guards for the Japanese invasion fleets heading towards Malaya. In the Japanese-held Marshall Islands, far to the east, 37 G3M bombers and 24 flying boats of the 24th Air Flotilla stood ready to attack isolated Allied outposts in the West Pacific. But the glittery potency of this offensive array shared a number of weaknesses that would eventually prove disastrous in an extended conflict. Nearly all were connected in one way or another to the Japanese assumption that the coming war would be swift and decisive. I would argue they can't really plan for it to be anything else. The Japanese don't have the infrastructure and strategic depth for a long war. They don't acknowledge this. This is one of the reasons why they have the doctrine of attrition and then decisive battle. And the idea is you attrit the enemy and then you have a decisive battle once you've mulled them down to a level which is appropriate for your force to equal and match. And so that's one of the problems you get, is they don't really have the economy to design for a long war. And one of the things you also have is that treasuries are never going to fund you preparing for a long war. Doesn't matter whether it's World War I, World War II, or other things. If you look at the treasury's preparations, they are not giving anyone the funds for a long, long war. You know, it's very quickly tuned in World War I, World War II. These are going to be 4 or 5 year wars. But if you looked at the war planning beforehand, they were talking about 1 to 2 year wars at maximum, because that's all the money they're going to get. That's the relative infrastructure. And that also explains a lot of the early decisions in the war, because they're going by the pre-war plans, which are planning for a short war of 1 or 2 years. And how long does it take to build a ship? 2 years. So, okay, what you've already got under construction is what you're going to get, nothing else. This is the reality of these plannings. And again, depends on the nation, but some of them were planning for war in 1942, some in 1945, some earlier, but very few earlier. Nearly all were connected in one way or another to the Japanese assumption that the coming war would be swift and decisive. Most of the types of combat aircraft had certain fatal defects, largely those of inadequate defensive protection for their fuel tanks and their aircrews. This meant that in an air war of any length, the attrition rates for Japanese aircraft would be severe. In a struggle with a naval enemy backed by the wealth of industrial resources available to the United States, there were too few of them for anything but a short conflict. As late as summer 1941, Admiral Inoue had drawn the attention of ranking Navy Ministry and General Staff personnel to material shortages in aircraft, particularly land-based bombers and flying boats. Navy's plans called for the production of 7,000 aircraft by April 1942. Yet in the summer of 1941, the current production of aircraft for the Navy of all types was only 162 planes a month. 162 planes a month. Inoue also took note of the shortages in machine guns, ammunition, most types of bombs, and Type 91 aerial torpedoes, as well as inadequate sources of fuel. There were as well the problem of inadequate numbers of trained personnel in inadequate training organizations, facilities and equipment. In 1937, the Navy had planned to have 5,000 thoroughly trained aircrew in place by 1941. But the China War forced both a modification of those numbers, down to 4,100, and a reduction in duration of training cycles. Then, in the several years immediately prior to the Pacific War, the accelerated build-up in naval air organization, weapons and equipment aggravated an already serious personnel shortage. By the time of Pearl Harbor, half of the Japanese Naval Air Service was, by its own reckoning, insufficiently trained, a situation that led to the widespread allocation of inexperienced crews. This is one of the reasons why, again, when I talk about air services being capable of night fighting and night strike, and, you sit there and go, okay, why can the Fleet Air Arm do this? Because the Fleet Air Arm had the training budget, but also if you look at it, the Fleet Air Arm doesn't get to expand dramatically until 1937 after the Inskip Award. And by that point, it's managed to build everything in process. So to an extent, the Royal Navy is managing to take advantage over its smaller size and its expansion. But even by the end of World War II, the Royal Navy is still obsessed with night flying and night training for its pilots, etc. But even then, it's relaxed off to deal with the growth in size. So the Royal Navy throughout World War II is probably the most capable of night flying. But the reason it's at that capability is because for the Americans it was lack of funding for the training. For the Japanese it's the expansion. And this is what I mean about nations being half a dozen one sixth the other. Because the Japanese probably had the advantage in terms of the breadth of their force in this period, and the breadth of ideas they're coming in, which is because they've managed to build up the size they have. But by building up to that size, they've also got a weakness in terms of the level of training of the overall force. The Americans, because they've been held back so much, are able to take a leap forward, because by the time they've actually got the experience already from their early war experience, that's only then the expansion is starting to come through and they can start funneling that experience into their expansion. So all these positions they create, then a decision is rarely a thing which is going to make you strong or is going to make you weak. Usually it's going to give you advantages and disadvantages. And operations and success is going to depend on how you play those advantages versus those disadvantages. Because the carrier units demanded the highest level of training, they could be supplied only at the sacrifice of the quality of many of the land-based air groups. At the opening of the Pacific War, for example, the table of organisation for the first-line air groups was nearly complete. But if one looks at their composition, particularly those of the 11th Air Fleet, it is clear that they contained a fairly high percentage of air crews assigned before their training was finished. In part, this is a consequence of the recent commissioning of the carriers Shokaku and Zukaku, which borrowed a number of the best air group leaders for their participation in the Hawaii operation. Finally, in the onrush of the Japanese naval air expansion, little attention was given to the unglamorous but critical problem of logistics. It was a neglect that was Navy-wide, and again it stemmed from the Navy's assumption that it would fight a short and victorious war. It manifested itself in an insufficient number of transport aircraft, in a paucity of spare parts from the magnetos to machine guns, in an inadequately developed system of combat theatre maintenance and repair, in a failure to recognise that a larger land-based air force would require more air bases, particularly in wartime, and a consequent failure to see that more bases would require adequate civilian engineering facilities and equipment to construct them. Worse, by Navy's own estimates, aviation fuels and lubricants were sufficient for only a year and a half of combat operations. In the opening months of war, as the Navy's aircraft swept the feeble Allied air defences from the skies of Western Pacific and Southeast Asia, none of these shortages were to count for much. But poor logistics was to become a terrible throttle hold on Japanese naval air power once advances were halted on the far perimeters of the Japanese conquests. Strategically, on the 8th December 1941, the Navy's aircraft were lifting off of carrier decks and lifting from land bases for defences of breathtaking distance and risk. In the Central Pacific, the carrier strike force was approaching the Hawaii Islands. In the Western Pacific, flocks of medium bombers lifted off the coral airstrips on Navy's bases in Micronesia to attack American Pacific outposts. On Taiwan, Navy fighters and bombers streaked southward toward Luzon, even as carrier aircraft flew westward to attack Minano. Medium bombers thundered up and over the palm-fringed air bases outside Saigon to spearhead the assault on British Malaya. In Japanese plans, these great aerial movements were aimed to achieve a vast empire of conquest in Asia and Pacific, which once occupied would be held against the enemy in great part by Japanese naval air power. But it can only be held if it can be sustained. It can only be sustained if you have the logistics for it. And this is why I've now got this section in here. Thank you. And now I've got my debit and credit card back in my wallet. That's always a good idea. I will get proper... I've already had the comments come through on this. I will get some proper bookmarks that I can use for these videos, rather than the very humorous and weird ones I have, as for most of my books. The grand causes of Japan's catastrophic collapse have been illuminated by a number of magisterial works on World War II. In addition to the late David Evans, and I dealt more specifically with the nation's defeat at sea in the last chapter of our volume on the pre-war Japanese Navy. And now sharpen my focus on the causes of the destruction of Japanese naval air power 1942-4. While the reasons are multiple, a few general categories stand out. First, the failure of the Navy to anticipate the kind of air combat it would be obliged to wage. Second, once in a new kind of air war, the failure to make the right decisions to deal with the realities. And third, the inability of Japanese industry and technology to support Japanese naval aviation against the emerging numerical and qualitative superiority of American air power. I would argue there's nothing really they can do. I would argue that the Japanese prepare for the war in which they can win. But if they don't get to fight that war, they don't have a chance. They need a war where their opponents are idiots and are going to charge straight into them. And the trouble is, both the British and the Americans have wargamed it enough that they know charging straight to the Japanese is not a sensible idea. In pre-war Japanese strategic planning documents, there were numerous references to the necessity to prepare for a war of attrition against the United States. But, in addition to underestimating the ability of the United States to force the pace of attrition, the Japanese Navy strategy to wage such a war was based on a disregard of fundamental reality of the Pacific. The Navy's plans called for the creation of a great chain of iron air bases that would form a defensive barrier around the nation's empire of conquest in the central and southwestern Pacific against any American counteroffensives to retake it. Shifting the Navy's long-range bombers from one to another of these unsinkable carriers as Yamamoto had viewed them, the Navy had believed that it could launch preemptive attacks against any enemy in advance. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of attrition. And I think this comes through in that I would say there is an attrition as the idea of attrition as a long war attrition, and there is attrition as an operational attrition. And I think most of the Japanese conception around attrition was an operational attrition. I think it was based on the idea, we're going to make the Americans come charging towards us, we're going to be able to attrit them with our forces as they're coming in, and we are going to be able to destroy them, and that's a short war approach attrition. Long war attrition is the Americans slowly come to you. They take one base. They don't charge the whole way in. They take a base. They pierce the outer defensive barrier, and then they take another, and then they take another, and they take another, and they do it slowly and methodically, and they just keep. And that is the Japanese definition of attrition: is you come charging in, they get to attrit you as you're coming in. So basically, as your forces coming in, they get to go, whoa, we've taken off this finger. Oh, we've taken off this finger. And, oh, we've taken off this finger. And that sort of thing. They get to attrit you down so they can then fight you in a decisive battle. And you'll keep coming. But the Americans and the British plan is more a case of, we take this. We take this. We take this. We take this. Not trying to push the whole way in one go, but take it in little bits. And that's the kind of long-form attrition which the Japanese could never win at. They know they don't have the industrial might for it. They really don't. They'd had to have started investing in industry and infrastructure a long time ago. They'd have had to start investing in pretty much the 1900s to be able to have maintain infrastructure industry to the extent that they could even hold a defensive war against these kinds of powers. And even then, they wouldn't be able to extend the war for that long. They'd be able to extend it more because they'd have more resources to expend, but those resources would still be expended and they'd still be used up. Here the Navy clearly misjudged the vast distances over which it would have to fight. Distances between Japanese bases throughout the western and southwestern Pacific proved too great even for the longest reach of its land-based aircraft, and thus it proved impossible to provide a flexible defence Yamamoto had envisaged. And thus, one by one, without substantial help from nearest air garrisons, the Navy's air bases fell from before the American amphibious tidal wave. I would say that's the problem of looking at a globe. You look at a globe, everything becomes magically manageable. You can use your compass and you can go. You start going through things and you start going, oh yes, we go from here to here to here, and start measuring it out. The reality is different. The unrealistic quality of the Navy's plans for winning an extended war is also apparent in the personnel policies and aircraft design priorities. The creation of a small but elite pool of naval aviators with no substantial reserve to back it up, nor any training program in place with which to do so, speaks of a mistaken assumption of a short, victorious conflict. That assumption is confirmed by the design and production of aircraft that provided scant means to protect the personnel who flew and fought in them, and thus did nothing to preserve that precious elite once the war of attrition began. I touched upon the Navy's failure to create adequate inadequate reserves of trained air crew at several points in these pages. With half of the naval air arm insufficiently trained at the opening of the Pacific War, it was difficult to fill needs of frontline air groups with fully qualified personnel as its elite formations were steadily ground down. By stripping the carrier air groups of both capable leadership and the best pilots, the land-based air groups were kept reasonably combat-ready into the spring of 1943. But by the time the land-based air crews had themselves been decimated, with no effective on-site training reserve to replace combat losses, the consequences of these training policies were ultimately fatal. Once the Navy recognised that it was far better to have lots of competent pilots than a handful of outstanding ones, it was too late. The terrible shredding in combat on Navy's top air units, the ever-increasing need for their replacement, and the decreasing time and fuel available for their adequate training to provide such replacement had by the late 1943 left the Navy with little but the greenest trainees who were quickly sacrificed in the fire of combat. I would argue this is the lesson which both Britain and America get from World War I, which Japan doesn't. If we consider Japan's air war in World War I, they have a very successful operation which depends on very, very highly qualified, highly skilled pilots. But it's a very small operation. If you have experience like the US do and the British do and the other nations do, fighting on the Western Front, fighting in the Middle East, fighting all around the world with aviation, you suddenly realize, hang on, I need a lot of pilots. And it's great to have these really great pilots, these really cool, some amazing pilots. But you know what's even better? A really great pilot with about 6 or 7 out of fairly good pilots with them to back up. And to keep themselves and protect their rear. That's amazing, because then you have like 10-to-1 advantages. And amazingly, that kind of advantage tends to win. American air personnel policies before and during the Pacific War stood in sharp contrast. The American emphasis on training far greater numbers of aviators, albeit at a somewhat lower standard performance, the assignment of training units aboard aircraft carriers, and the provision of aircraft that offered aircrew greater life-saving protection gave American aviators an overwhelming advantage in air combat by the end of 1942. In summers, Fushida Mitsu and Okayama Masaki concluded in their account of the Battle of Midway, the Japanese Naval Air Service failed to realize that aerial warfare is a battle of attrition, and that a strictly limited number of even the most skilled pilots could not possibly win out over an unlimited number of able pilots. It has been commonplace in Western accounts to view the Japanese tradition as indifferent to the expenditure of human life in battle. Specifically, it has been argued that the Japanese Navy undervalued the lives of its few precious aviators. Yet there were elements complicating this picture. One must understand that the pilots themselves, embracing a Bushido ethos, did not want armour and self-sealing fuel tanks on their aircraft, since such additions seemed to imply a selfish concern for their own survival. There was also an intangible, that of the stoicism and gammon, perseverance that pervaded Japanese society. Japanese were simply ready to put up with combat conditions that the West would have considered intolerable. I'm not sure I agree with Petey there. I know what flashes into my mind is the fact that the Royal Navy aviators, especially the people flying the torpedo bombers, and which therefore had the internal fuel tank in the cockpit of the Swordfish going into Taranto, the observers sitting in the back were waist deep in aviation fuel and were soaked in it by the time they go in. I think if you're prepared to do that, I think this is quite common. I think there are a lot of different things, but there's a level at which you're prepared to accept it as a general rule. I think there are decisions made by all the air services about what they want. I think for the Japanese and the Americans, and a lot of emphasis is placed on range and speed, and that breeds a slightly different style of aircraft, and it depends on your approach. When you don't have the really big, powerful engines and the fuel supplies which the Americans have, and synthetic oil, and the various oils and synthetic oils which keep those engines nicely lubricated, you then go other ways to get that speed and range. And I think that's what we're seeing, and it's a tolerance of, I will accept X and Y for Z and V. I will accept that for that, because I want that, because that's my winning strategy. And I think that's what we see going on there. As we have seen, the Navy pursued aircraft designs in which safety factors, armour, self-sealing gas tank structural integrity that might have saved the lives of pilots were sacrificed for greater performance, speed and manoeuvrability. Once the harsh lessons of the China-Pacific Wars had been absorbed, the inability of the Navy to provide armour and self-sealing tanks was due to a combination of bureaucratic inflexibility and a weak industrial infrastructure rather than to any opposition to these features in and of themselves. And that's another thing. The Japanese infrastructure and the Japanese production facilities couldn't adapt as quickly. They couldn't implement these things. Of course, as Eric Beauregard reminds us, the devastating attrition rate for the Navy's air crews was also due to operational, that is, non-combatant losses that affected Japanese and Allied air crews alike. Erratic and often violent weather, unfamiliar and often mountainous terrain, navigational mistakes over the ocean, primitive and often bomb-damaged runways, aircraft fatigue, pilot error and mechanical failures, omnipresent dangers that confronted the Allies as well, took a horrendous toll on Japanese aircraft and air crews. For the Japanese air crews, the 1,000-mile round trip from Rabaul to Guadalcanal and back posed far greater risks of dangerous weather and navigational error than their enemy counterparts based at Henderson Field and other American bases in the Solomons. Moreover, the Japanese Navy, while it made every effort to rescue downed pilots, never developed anything like the Allied system of sea rescue. Although the Naval Air Service actively rotated pilots early in the war, after major pilot losses at Guadalcanal, the rotation system began to break down. Moreover, it was not just the decline in quality of air crews that accelerated erosion of Japanese naval air power in the Pacific. Heavy losses in trained ground crews also weakened the Navy's air groups. I have said that the most significant personnel losses at Midway occurred not in fighter cockpits, but among trained maintenance personnel who were down with the 4 carriers. Similarly, the loss of skilled ground crews often abandoned to their fates when the Navy evacuated remaining air crews from islands under siege, substantially weakened the land-based air groups. Yep. And that is a big problem. That was one of the massive problems with loss of courageous and glorious early in World War II for the Royal Navy. And it's the same for lots of navies. It's not just the aircraft or carrier you've lost, it's also the trained air crew. The trained, for the Royal Navy, it was the specific loss I can point to is the fact that the loss of the damage control and the trainee damage control officers from carriers immediately affects the other damage control personnel they draw from other carriers. And of course, damage control in an aircraft carrier is different than that of most smaller ships because the height above the sea is so much greater, and therefore the centre of mass is so much higher. And this means a carrier is one of those ships you start flooding earlier. If there's any kind of thing, you almost start counter-flooding almost immediately you get any problems. Whereas with any other ships, the rule is you don't let, the enemy's job is to let in water, not you. Counter-flooding is the last thing you do in most warships. In an aircraft carrier, it's one of the first things you do, because you don't want to start heeling over. And that's what caused the loss of Ark Royal, the whole debate where the guy is going, well, the manual says do this, but my entire life history says don't do this. And so I'm going to go with my entire life service record, because that's my instinct. And that's the problem. That is the problem. Speaking of the Royal Navy strategy in the Far East, 1919 to 1939. And, well, there are 2 sections I want to talk about in this one. Undertaking a war with Japan was recognised. Yeah, it's my Volvo card. Undertaking a war with Japan was recognised as being logistically difficult, given the distance and poor infrastructure, and merely having a war strategy such as a War Memorandum Eastern was not enough to guarantee success against Japan, nor was having a set of tactical guidelines, although these were certainly indicative of the confident attitude the Royal Navy was rediscovering between 1919 and 1939 as it tackled the problems of sending a battle fleet to the Far East and how it was to fight its enemy. Both the strategic and tactical problems need to be refined through testing, questioning and development as an important part of what Fisk called the preparation strategy. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, the Royal Navy was actively doing this, setting strategical exercises based around the prospect of a war in the Far East, running tactical exercises which could evaluate the usefulness of the battle fleet and how the submarine and aircraft carrier can be integrated into it, as well as revising the battle instructions. Exercises were undertaken regularly, either as staff exercises carried out at the Royal Naval Staff College, Greenwich, and the Tactical School, Portsmouth, or they could be carried out by individual vessels or squadrons, such as the annual combined manoeuvres by the Atlantic and Mediterranean fleets, which gave the opportunity for the fleets most likely to be sent east in a future war to practice together and refine their tactical expertise. The problem with any exercise was in deciding their aim and what the results, or rather lessons, were. The ideal would probably have been to have an exercise which combines strategical, tactical and training elements in one. thoroughly investigated a problem and came up with the clear conclusions. In reality, for various reasons, an exercise may have concentrated on only one element, and the results would inevitably vary, depending on the level of training the participants already had. A squadron of ships which had been together for a long time and which had previously exercised together would perform differently to a newly formed squadron or a newly commissioned ship. It would also be dependent on what conclusions the planners wanted to test, which may have further limited their usefulness. The main object of the exercises often was to allow mistakes and misjudgments to be made in peacetime, and not when it really mattered in battle. In many ways, their main value was in providing a further insight into how the Royal Navy saw itself and its role. For planning purposes, the Admiralty had originally assumed that war was likely any time from 1929, influenced by the original guidance of the 10-year rule, rather than Japanese intentions. Among examples of the planning exercises are a series of planning problems which formed a part of the Senior Warrant Officers course at the Royal Navy College, Greenwich. In 1925, course members were given various strategic problems to solve. Yes, the Senior Warrant Officers course. This is one of the interesting things. The Royal Navy likes to have lots of levels thinking about war and how they would fight a war, and that includes warrant officers as well as the regular officers. Of course, whilst the aim of these exercises were more likely to have been to give course members experience in solving the sorts of problems more normally faced by strategic planners in the Admiralty, the scenarios themselves offer an interesting insight into how the Plans Division at the Admiralty may have been expecting a Far Eastern war to develop. Now, again, to emphasise this, why is the Royal Navy getting warrant officers involved? A, they're a tap of tremendous resource and experience, so testing them out and seeing what they're going to come with can give you ideas which you will never get from your officer corps. But also, these are the people who are going to be advising senior officers in a war, are going to be are going to be keeping a ship going, helping to facilitate damage control, helping to maintenance, helping logistics, or running the whole ship in many, many respects. They're the senior NCOs of your force. You want them as informed as possible. You want them capable of giving you planning, giving you advice, giving you structure. You want them to understand what you're doing and what you want out of your force, because they're going to be able to then best achieve and best structure their own thinking, their own decision making in light of that. So it makes a lot of sense. One exercise, the Scheme X2, concerned issues of worldwide trade defence with a scenario set in US waters, following a declaration of war between Britain and Japan, with the United States staying neutral. Singapore had been relieved, but was suffering sporadic raids by Japanese battle cruisers, whilst apart from sweeps by the aircraft carriers, the Japanese battle fleet remained in home waters, waiting to draw the British battle fleet north for a decisive battle on their terms. Amazingly, the British and the Americans very quickly work out what the best Japanese scenario and strategy is, to draw the British and Americans into Japanese home waters and smack them down there. A cruiser patrol line had stopped the Japanese trade of Dutch East Indies in Europe. Hong Kong remained in British hands, and all British trade north of Saigon had ceased. Hong Kong staying in British hands, that's an interesting one. Japanese naval activities were therefore mainly limited to the commerce raiding by armed merchant cruisers, and in order to guard against these, a squadron had been formed to protect British trade between the United States and Australia, to cover the western approaches to the Panama Canal, to stop any Japanese trade in the United States. Apart from the enemy chosen, Japan, there was little new in this scenario, it being very similar to the trade protection role that the Royal Navy had adopted against German raiders in 1914. Hence, the scheme dealt with the disposition of the available ships following a suspected Japanese radar being sighted operating in the Caribbean, and another Japanese ship sighted passing through the Panama Canal. To counter these movements and to maintain sea communications, when not enough was known of the enemy or their possible intentions, the star solution was to detach a light cruiser and armed merchant ship and cruisers into the Pacific Ocean, whilst placing superior forces in the threatened area. The more useful of these exercises, from the point of view of suggesting how the Royal Navy saw War Memorandum Eastern working, was Scheme J1, or JI. A war with Japan. It was assumed that at some point in time in the 1920s, Japan would take advantage of a deteriorating European situation, worsening relations between Britain and France, to suppress excessive demands on China, and forced the Netherlands to sell Sumatra to them. As a consequence of this, the Royal Navy had sent a fleet composed of vessels that were expected to be sent eastward in the event of an actual war: the 2 Nelson-class ships, 5 R-class battleships, the battle cruisers Repulse, Renown, and Hood, the aircraft carriers Glorious, Furious, and Eagle, and a light cruiser squadron of 5 light cruisers, 7 destroyer flotillas, that is about 63 destroyers,
32 submarines organised into 2 submarine flotillas, 1 mine layer, minesweepers and depot and repair ships to Singapore, where it arrived in the month of April. Coastal motor torpedo boats for the local defence of Singapore and 6 submarines for the duties at Hong Kong were also attached. The China squadron of 5 light cruisers was at Hong Kong, and a light cruiser of the Royal Australian Navy were also available. In short, this was a formidable naval force, which partly reflected the Royal Navy's numerical superiority during the 1920s, and the fact that up till 1931 at least, the Admiralty could have deployed the numbers of ships needed, although the fact that it was virtually all the Royal Navy that was being used, and that there was no base developed in Singapore to supply such a fleet, showed to be a paper exercise. And I do agree with this. The Royal Navy plans were great, but Singapore wasn't there yet for it. Nevertheless, in May, a force of Royal Marines, including the Mobile Naval Base Defence Party, arrived, and on 5th of May, the Commander-in-Chief Far Eastern Fleet was informed that war would be declared at midnight on the 14th and 15th of May, Greenwich Mean Time. As the situation with France had now stabilised, reinforcements were also being sent out to arrive by August. These would be the 5 Queen Elizabeth-class battleships, 4 Iron Duke battleships, and the battlecruiser Tiger, 12 Sea-class cruisers, 3 flotilla leaders, and 24 destroyers, and a further 20 submarines. Until their arrival, an advanced base for operations was to be established for operations against Japan's China trade. Virtually the entire strength of the Navy was being used in this strategic exercise, which was being carried out 1 year after the first War Memorandum of Eastern had been written. And Scheme JI did reflect some of the contemporary thinking. The arrival of the main fleet, followed by the operations, which would end in a decisive naval battle. Hong Kong remained in British hands, and Europe was also apparently pacified, allowing the entire Royal Navy, with the exception of the 3 King George V class battleships, 3 small aircraft carriers, 12 cruisers and some 60 destroyers, to cope with all other naval duties. For the purpose of the exercise, it was envisaged that following its arrival at Singapore, the Far Eastern Fleet would sail towards the Okinawa group of islands, arrive at the island of Nagagusuku, 1, on the 15th of May, land the Royal Marines without opposition. These islands would certainly have been considered suitable for an advanced base for the British fleet, as they were beyond land-based aircraft range, but near enough to Japan to cause problems with its trade, and they may well have been considered as a possible objective on the move north from Hong Kong. Timers in exercise seem to be very optimistic, and I do agree with the response on that one, not to say unrealistic, reflecting its abstract nature. It has to be remembered that this was not detailed strategic war planning to be used by the fleet, but a planning exercise set in a particular context to give course participants exercise of producing answers to particular problems, and its inclusion here is an example of how much the thinking of a war against Japan was figuring in Admiralty thinking. So, for example, by the 22nd of May, 1 week after arrival and within the timescale set for securing a base, the Mobile Naval Base Defence Organisation had fortified the harbour against attacks by submarines and destroyers and installed the anti-aircraft defences. By 12th of June, the base defences were completed with booms and minefields, although the gun batteries were insufficient to defend the base against a bombardment, and the defences were not strong enough to repel a major amphibious landing. British cruisers and submarines were operating from here against Japanese trade to the Yangtze River and Shanghai. In the rear, Singapore, the fleet's major base, had been transformed into a protected anchorage with a storage capacity and repair facilities of Invergordon. That's 500,000 tons of oil fuel had arrived, and one of the ex-German 40,000-ton floating docks was positioned in the old strait. The special idea of the exercise was that the Japanese iron ore stocks were low, and so 8 Japanese freighters loaded with iron ore were being prepared to run from Shanghai to Japan. Additionally, Danish and 5 Swedish ships loaded with oil consigned to their own nationals, not the Japanese government, had also arrived in Shanghai from Borneo, adding the presence of neutral vessels into the convoy in the problem. Intelligence reports from an agent in Shanghai indicated that a convoy made up of Japanese and Swedish ships was to sail for Karatsu and Wakamatsu on the 20th of June, speed 8 knots with a close escort of 6 destroyers. On 21st of June, a squadron of 4 Japanese battlecruisers, 1 large aircraft carrier, and 1 destroyer flotilla would arrive as distant cover for this important convoy. And again, let's think about this. This is in the 20s. They are thinking about this, and there are aircraft carriers being a major part of it. It's always worth remembering that. Lots of aircraft carriers involved. The Japanese fleet was at Sasebo. This was made up of 6 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, 11 light cruisers, 1 destroyer flotilla, and 1 submarine flotilla. It was believed to be at 2 hours' notice to steam. There were a further 3 light cruisers, 24 destroyers, and 25 submarines available if needed. Additionally, Japanese submarines have been reported off Sidmouth Island, Cape Yakima, and off the entrance to Nagagasuku 1. Hitherto, the British aim had been to maintain the advanced base until the arrival of reinforcements. The Aegis report presented the possibility of striking a blow against the Japanese fleet by bringing a portion of it in the convoy screen to action. the whole of the British fleet, less the battleships Ramillies and Royal Sovereign, involved in a collision with each other, were available, and although the Japanese were judged to be slightly superior in fighting power, I do love the fact they added that into exercise. Yes, 2 of our battleships are going to have collided with each other. Just adding that into the exercise. And although the Japanese were judged to be slightly superior in fighting power, the British battlecruisers had a 4-knot superiority in speed over the Japanese vessels. Sasebo lay 440 miles away, 22 hours at 20 knots. The rendezvous point for the Japanese convoy and covering force was 330 miles away from Sasebo, 16.5 hours at 20 knots, and 440 miles away from the British base at Nagasaki, 22 hours at 20 knots. It was judged to be unlikely the Japanese would attack the base with the convoy operation in progress, but more likely they would sort out the first fleet to support the covering force and convoy. It seemed to be in British interest to attack the battlecruiser force before the Japanese battle fleet could intervene and not seek an action with the Japanese battle fleet. Before the arrival of the reinforcements, the position of the Japanese battlecruisers was renowned, and they were an inferior force hampered by their responsibilities to the convoy. Defeating them would increase the British force's numerical superiority and adversely affect Japanese morale. In undertaking this mission, the risk of accidentally meeting with the entire Japanese battle fleet and of leaving the advanced base undefended had to be accepted. The scene was being set for a classic action, a raid against a convoy designed to defeat a weaker opponent or portion of the enemy fleet and draw out the main enemy strength in its defence. Now, I would like to point out, and I'm going to move on to a different section of the book next, that's kind of reversing the World War I scenario for the Royal Navy. It's going, oh yeah, this is us going after the Japanese battlecruisers like they went after ours. I also love that they have the Japanese putting the battlecruisers on convoy escort, because realistically, he says, as he surreptitiously takes his driving license out of the book, they would have been. That's the only option. The Japanese are not going to deploy their battle fleet, but I honestly don't think the battle cruisers get used for convoy covering. I think the Japanese would use their heavy cruisers. I really do think that. I don't think they're going to deploy their battle cruisers. I don't think the Congos are going to be sent. And then we have this bit in the conclusion, which is interesting. Financial limitations between the First and Second World Wars were undoubtedly a contributing factor to this, and despite the increase in the number of close-range anti-aircraft guns carried, including the highly regarded 22-pounder, that multiple pom-pom gun, and the new dual-purpose weapon batteries on all-new battleships, aircraft carriers, anti-aircraft cruisers, and many destroyers, the anti-aircraft capability of many British warships was less effective than was claimed. Many destroyers had a main battery which was incapable of sufficient elevation to engage aircraft, for example, and relied instead on Lewis guns, 0.5-inch machine guns, 2-pounder pom-poms, and single 3-inch or 4-inch high-angle gun, in addition to their high speed and maneuverability for their anti-aircraft defense. Now, why have I picked this page? Well, guess what comes up next. That not every naval officer was as confident in the anti-aircraft arrangements is evidenced by Rear Admiral Henderson writing in 1932 and warning that the primary defence of the fleet against air attack is not justified by any data or experience. No realistic firing against aircraft has taken place since the last war, and in my opinion, the value of our own high-angle control system Mark I is rated too high. In common with others, we are apt to overrate the capabilities of our weapons in peacetime. Henderson. Whereas most naval officers believed in the superiority of anti-aircraft defence, Henderson was not as confident, pointing out that during the First World War, more aircraft had been destroyed in aerial combat than by anti-aircraft fire. He further believed that the smaller numbers of aircraft employed at sea would make interception easier than over land, but until an effective means of early warning and fighter with sufficient endurance and firepower could be developed, the Royal Navy would continue to rely on high-angle barrage fire. Yes, air defence at sea. Admiral Henderson is fun. Now, I have to admit, I did do a little bit longer on the Japanese than I did on the I'm going to do on the British or the American books, but yeah, I think it's what I think. To me, that's what those books are worthwhile. Though I do love both those books. I do love the contents in them. I'd say with Andrew, I spent a lot of time in my PhD looking at his work, and points I agreed and points I disagreed, because I come from. I would say he, and I would say this to him, and I think I have said it during a conference, I chatted with him. He tends to, he comes from a very much research background, looking at the papers and the documents that are written, and I do the same. But I come from a bit of a forensic engineering background because of my family history in engineering and the amount of the fact that I worked with a lot of engineering students. I taught history of engineering to engineering students and all these things. And I tend to look at what are the actual compromises they're making in the design of these things, rather than what they're talking about compromising. And sometimes there is a differential between those two. And that is something which I find a lot in British ship design. There is a lot of, we talk one thing, we do another, and why is that happening? And that comes up quite a lot. But now, to the Americans. Now, To Train the Fleet for War by Albert A. Noffy is a book which is wonderful. It's also a book which is all about the US Navy's fleet problems, 1923 to 1940. It's more accessible in Kindle. I will admit that. It is cheaper. I think it's free in Kindle. But I like the physical copy. I like the physical copy because it allows me to open it, cite it, and use it. And there is a lot of interesting stuff in here to cite. One of the examples I will use here, and this explains a lot about the US Navy issues in this period in terms of their testing, is on the morning of the 24th, Blue, the carrier, Lexington, had sent up a routine air patrols from a position of about 280 miles west of Panama, which was supplemented by patrol bombers operating out of Bahia, Honda. On 0903 hours, a Blue destroyer spotted the battleships of the Black Striking Force at a range of roughly 22,000 yards, about 10.9 nautical miles. Although taken under battleship fire, the destroyer escaped. Throughout the rest of the day, the Blue aircraft destroyers and light cruisers made occasional contact with the Black Striking Force, one light cruiser coming close enough for a battleship to open fire. As evening fell, Black intercepted and deciphered a Blue message ordering a destroyer concentration to conduct a nocturnal surface attack on the striking force. Acting on this intelligence, the Black Striking Force adopted a defensive formation, but the Blue destroyers failed to attack. By nightfall on 23rd, Saratoga and Omaha had reached a position east of the Galapagos. Appropriate honours were rendered to the Neptunus Rex on the morning of the 24th. Then at noon, on the recipient of information that Blue had located the Black Striking Force, the two ships proceeded northward at high speed. As Saratoga and her escort proceeded northward, the main bodies of the two fleets continued to spar northwest of Panama. Late on the morning of the 25th, Blue aircraft and destroyers again established contact with the Black Striking Force. Somewhat later, Blue's Lexington was ordered to engage the Black battleships, reported as being 22 miles from a position. In fact, the Black battle wagons were only about 15 miles distant. Okay. The idea of battleships getting that close to my carrier, I know. As a result, even before the first airplane took off, Lexington was spotted by the Black battleships, which emerged from a local rain squall and took her under fire at 12:18 hours, ranged at about 30,000 yards, that's 14.8 nautical miles. The firing continued for 23 minutes, during which the Lexington managed to get a number of aircraft aloft, which remained strafing and bombing runs on the Black battleships. At 12:41, Lexington managed to flee out of battleship gunning range by virtue of her high speed and another rain squall. Ouch! This incident, in which a fast carrier was intercepted by much slower battleships, would be repeated often during the fleet problems, due particularly to the lack of radar, but primarily to the need for carriers to approach targets very closely as a consequence of the short range of contemporary aircraft. The incident also presented some difficulties for the umpires. In the end, they ruled that because during her engagement with the battleships, Lexington's aircraft had taken off under fire, the attacks they made during the engagement were not assessed against Black. In addition, although the damage Lexington suffered during this encounter should certainly have been merited a ruling of sunk, desirous of securing the maximum benefit of having carried in maneuvers, the umpires simply ruled her heavily damaged, limiting her ability to operate aircraft for a time and reducing her speed to 18 knots. This is the problem with exercises. You get out what you get in, and depending on how you properly apply the rules, you will get more out or less out. At about 13:40 hours, as Black battleships closed on the Gulf of Panama, Blue destroyers attempted to make a torpedo attack on them, but rain squalls and Black destroyers interfered and they retired. The salutary contact between Black and the Blue and the Black Striking Force continued until evening. Meanwhile, of course, Saratoga and Omaha, coming up from the Galapagos, were fast approaching the Blue patrol areas. At 1600 hours on the 25th, the Blue destroyer Breck was spotted and shortly put out of action by gunfire, but Breck had managed to get off a signal. The Black cruiser Detroit nearby picked this up and began searching for the carrier. At about 1800 hours, the cruiser was close enough for Saratoga to open fire with her 8-inch guns, and Detroit was ruled to have been sunk. Since by this time Omaha was running low on fuel, Detroit was ordered to take her place. Despite officially being sunk and also now attached to Black, Detroit continued to relay information on Saratoga's position to Blue. Although this one was one of the most egregious instances of cheating in the fleet problems, Detroit's skipper, Captain Richard Drace White, does not seem to have suffered for it, retiring as a rear admiral several years later. Think about that. You've been sunk in your exercise, so you are dead on one side, and you are therefore assigned to the other side. and you continue telling your original side exactly where you are and where the carrier is. How realistic is that? How realistic is that? In any Alpha Navy, I think there was scenarios where officers would have tried to do certain similar things in the Royal Navy. In one of their cases, they were relieved of command by their XO for the exercise, and then they were sent home. And the other one, after the officers aboard the ship went, "Excuse me, sir," he decided not to. But it was considered bad form for your career, and you weren't going to get promoted any further. Because the whole point of it, you in the Navy, as a Navy, you can't learn from exercises if their results are tampered with. If their results are broken by a false play on your side, within your forces, then you can't trust the results of the exercise, and you can't learn everything from them. If you can't learn everything from them, you're wasting fuel. You're doing nothing of value. I would argue that Lexington was ruled as surviving is already a problem on the Empire side. I would argue that that Saratoga is allowed to continue and this guy is promoted is a problem. I would argue that this exercise, and this, by the way, for those wondering, is the 1929 Fleet Problem 9 exercise. I would argue that these events invalidate this exercise as a learning experience. They mean you can't draw proper information from it because what are they doing? What the frigate are they doing? To me, some of the exercises, and it goes for all the navies, they have issues with it, but it's how the navies institutionally approach it. In his case, specifically Captain Richard Drace White's, I've looked into, he has a lot of political connections, as I see it, and that's why he gets preserved, that's why he gets to make a Rear Admiral. But honestly, I'd have kicked him out for a conduct unbecoming. I would have literally keelhauled the guy to set an example, because he's invalidated the exercise. During the night of the 25th to 26th, alerted to Saratoga's approach by Detroit, Blue Commander Taylor ordered Lexington to intercept the black carrier. Delayed by the restriction on her speed, Lexington was unable to locate the enemy carrier. As a result, at 05:48 on January 26, Saratoga began launching 70 aircraft from a point about 140 miles south of the canal. The strike package consisted of 17 T-4M bombers, 49 F-2B and F-3B fighters, 3 O-2U-2 scouts, and 1 OL-8 amphibian communications aircraft. Despite Detroit's continuing communication with Blue, Saratoga's airstrike achieved complete surprise, arriving undetected at about 0700 hours to destroy the Miraflores and Pedro Miguel locks, before going on to attack an airbase and other facilities. Although a patrol of 6 Army fighters attempted to intercept them, and several other Army fighters sorted as well, the attackers escaped without loss to enemy action. Some aircraft, however, lower on fuel than others, were forced to land at enemy airfields, where they were interned. Several of these black airmen failed to destroy their codebooks, providing Blue with an intelligence coup. More than the fact that they had the cruiser, which is supposed to be escorting the Blue's aircraft carrier, is broadcasting her position to their fleet. They really need more of an intelligence coup going on. And Saratoga's success was compounded when the aircraft contender, Urustuk, the surrogate carrier accompanying the Black Support Force, launched the Sikorsky XPS-2 amphibian, representing a notional 24 aircraft. As Saratoga's aircraft were hitting the Pacific side of the canal, the amphibian made a near simultaneous attack on the Caribbean side to destroy the Gatun locks. Providing a cautionary lesson on the use of surrogate and constructive forces, the approach of the amphibian had been detected by the defenders. The Army was still labouring under the assumption that Black would have both Saratoga and Langley. The Blue Naval Command not having informed them that Urustuk was serving as emergency stand-in for Langley. As a result, the Army expected that any attack would be in a squadron strength. Thus, when only a single amphibian was detected, it was assumed to be a routine reconnaissance flight and no effort was made to intercept. Since the amphibian was launched at very long range, upon completing his mission and as instructed, the pilot landed nearby Blue Field and interned himself. Unfortunately, in his enthusiasm to firstly inform the enemy that locks had been destroyed, he too neglected to destroy his codebook before landing, providing the enemy with yet another intelligence bonus. Now, I would like to then point out that after this, following her rather spectacular raid on the canal, Saratoga now had a run of bad luck. To recover her aircraft, she had to approach rather close to the canal zone, as planned by Pratt and Reeves. The Black Striking Force, steaming from the northwest at a lower speed, was supposed to join Saratoga in the Gulf of Panama. However, navigation error and the tentative movement engagements on elements of the blue main body on the 24th caused the Striking Force to miss the rendezvous by about 140 miles. As a result, shortly after her airstrike was away at 06:15 hours, Saratoga, operating Foggy River, was located by blue battle wagons, making a sweep of the Gulf of Panama. Taken under fire at relatively close range, she was ruled sunk. Soon after, a blue submarine fired 4 torpedoes at her from only 1,200 yards, again sinking her. I'm sure they were kind of helped to that by the fact that, let's see, her escorting cruiser, which was supposed to be defending her, Detroit, under the Captain Richard Drace White, was broadcasting her position to them. Does kind of make it easy to find and kill your opponent when you're being told where they are. It's brilliant. It's so relevant and so realistic. It really is. I love this book. I really do. And then we get to Fleet Problem 19, April 1938. Okay, exercise 74, and there are 2 pages of this I wish to read to you, and then we will discuss them. This was intended to exercise the carrier air groups and patrol wing 2 in making coordinated attacks on a fleet disposition at the same time to the exercise fleet in repelling air attacks. The submission planned to be tested was tentative to fleet disposition 4V, which was designed to maximize fleet defense against air attack. 22-mile diameter formation placed the train at the center, with the battleships further forward and the carriers positioned to the rear. Although for this exercise the carriers were not actually part of the formation, in practice they were still tied to the battle line, leaving them limited maneuvering room, which was necessary to help them evade air attack and also to operate aircraft effectively. For approximately 1,000 hours to about 1,200 hours, the fleet was subject to a series of air attacks by aircraft from Lexington, Saratoga, Ranger, and Patrol Wing 2, for a total of 15 waves. The summary in conclusion by Sinkus Claude Bosch was that the attacks were well delivered and skillfully coordinated, but he added the withdrawal of individual squadrons was not as well done as were the attacks. Comments on the effectiveness of the fleet's anti-aircraft fire ranged from enthusiastic to suggestions from Sinkus that more practice was needed. Enthusiastic is good thing. Practice needed. You're enthusiastically firing in the wrong direction. Exercise 77. Submarine torpedo attack on the fleet, April 6, 1938. Exercise 77 involved a series of attacks against the fleet by Submarine Squadron 4. There were 13 submarines, a light cruiser and 2 aircraft tenders, without aircraft in the attack force. Designated black. Each submarine was assigned a patrol lane 4 miles wide, with the surface ships assigned as scouts on the expected direction of the enemy. White was in cruising disposition 4H, on a course that varied between 345 degrees and 0-100 degrees, in zigzagging at 15 knots. This course took the fleet across 11 of the submarine patrol lines. Although Black began taking its positions at 0500 hours and White at 0600 hours, the exercise actually began at about 0700 hours and lasted until about 1030 hours. The extremely fine weather greatly favoured White until late in the exercise, when the seas began to grow rougher. Aircraft were able to detect submarines even when submerged, and periscopes were spotted from surface ships at distances of up to 7 miles. 12 of the submarines fired a total of 12 practice and 36 constructive torpedoes. Of the practice torpedoes fired, 6 scored hits, 2 of which struck ships, other than those at which they were aimed. 8, possibly 9 of the submarines were detected by the defenders and ruled destroyed, which probably did not encourage aggressiveness in submarine skippers. Although the results of the exercise were not favourable to submarines, there was some recognition on the mitigating circumstances. The weather was unfavourable to attackers. In addition, as the Commander Submarine Force observed, this was the first or second time that many of the submarine commanding officers ever saw battleships through a periscope, or at least attempted attacks on so large a formation of heavy ships with such a numerous screen. He recommended that the similar exercises be made as a regular feature of the fleet problems. Sinkus Bloch noted that the exercises had provided excellent training, but was merely an elementary training exercise rather than a test of advanced submarine tactics. Also recommended more training. These were well-reasoned comments, but the conclusion drawn by Captain Robert A. Theobald, commanding the Nevada, BB-56, who later rose to Rear Admiral, and had no background in submarine operations, seems to have had a greater impression. The attacks demonstrated once again the absolute necessity for submarines in smooth waters to conduct their attacks from deep submergence using sound equipment only. This comment drew considerable attention amongst senior submariners who were already committed to sonar and attack tactics. It's amazing when someone agrees with your already charted course. You do so like hearing them. Exercise 77 was actually biased against the black submarines. Conducted in daylight, the submarines had no choice but to attempt attacks from deep submergence using sound equipment only, or risk being destroyed on surface by white air screen long before they could get into position to fire from periscope depth. The reliance on so-called sonar attacks proved one of the several handicaps to operations of American submarines during the early part of World War II. Yep. And Exercise 78. Battle Line Formation Tactics, 7th April 1938. Purely tactical in nature, Exercise 78 saw a Western fleet of 4 battleships, 7 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 33 destroyers, plus Saratoga and Ranger, engaged against an Eastern fleet of 5 battleships, 7 heavy cruisers, and about 33 destroyers, plus Lexington. For these maneuvers, the Western fleet was assumed to have no spotter aircraft on its battleships and battle cruisers, relying on Ranger, as assigned as a battle line carrier for scouting and spotting aircraft. For the purpose of the exercise, the geography of the Hawaiian Islands was radically altered, so that Oahu was considered the eastern edge of the considerable landmass extending to the west, whilst Hawaii proper was at the northern end of a similar landmass extending to the south. Thus, the action was canalized in the area of Oahu and west Hawaii. The Western Fleet was under orders to approach this relatively narrow opening from the southwest and force its way through by nightfall, opposed by the Eastern Fleet initially northeast of Molokai. The exercise began at 0600 hours, under poor weather conditions, a low ceiling, strong winds, rough seas, and rain squalls. Although the Western Fleet maintained only 14.5 knots, many of its destroyers were old four pipers and had trouble keeping up. The Western Fleet failed to put aircraft aloft, while the Eastern Fleet launched a number of scouts from its heavy cruisers. One of these scouts spotted the Western Fleet at 0740 hours, and from then on the Eastern Fleet never lost track of its opponent, despite worsening weather conditions that caused periodic cancellation of flight operations over the course of the day. As the fleets approached, they shifted their cruising disposition several times, testing various formations. Tentative surface combat began at 11:12 hours, when Eastern heavy cruisers spotted some Western battleships, briefly coming under fire before fleeing under cover of smoke. Thereafter, sporadic contact and exchange of gunfire occurred until 12:40 hours, when the battleships of both sides came into contact. The result was a complex surface action, some 45 miles southwest of Lanai. The battleships engaged at ranges decreasing from about 30,000 yards to about 15,000 yards. Supported by cruisers and destroyers. At about 1300 hours, the Western Fleet attempted a series of destroyer attacks on both ends of the eastern battle line. These were frustrated by defensive fire and heavy weather, with serious losses. A few minutes later, at 13:13 hours, Exercise 78 was declared over. In the course of the fighting, the Western Fleet suffered heavily, with one battleship, a light cruiser, and numerous destroyers ruled sunk, and with heavy damage to its remaining vessels. The 3 surviving battleships had an average of 70% damage, Saratoga 65%, and Ranger 31%. White had taken damage as well, but had only lost 3 destroyers. Columns at Exercise 78 included observation of the Western Fleet's right flank destroyer divisions attacking without heavy cruiser support, and suffered particularly heavily, all being sunk, while those on the left flank, with the benefit of cruiser support, had survived with varying degrees of damage, suggesting that cruiser firepower had proven valuable in protecting the attacking ships. I'm not surprised. I'm really not surprised. Now, the thing is, I said I would discuss this more once we've finished, and I'm going to. As you can see, fleet exercises, and this has been something which I've kept coming back to in recent videos and recent discussions. Garbage in, garbage out is a rule with computers. It is a rule which many people who are involved in computers will tell you. It's the same with exercises. How you set up and frame the exercises will define how useful the information is. How strictly you hold people to standards within exercises is going to affect what the information that comes out of. What I love about all 3 of these forces is they are exercising tremendously throughout the interwar years, through 1920s and 1930s. The Royal Navy has an advantage. They certainly have got more funding, an easier argument to get more funding for the larger exercises, and they do them. The US do large exercises, though. The Japanese do a large exercise, and they're all doing tabletop exercises. And they're all learning lessons from them. But the quality of those lessons depend absolutely on how focused you are on actually learning lessons versus how focused you are on going through performative, excuses for decisions you've already made. And I think that's really the legacy. But today's question, and I think I'm going to finish this video on question-wise, is I hope you enjoyed those books. I hope if you haven't got them, you go and consider buying them. They're really good books. But more importantly, the question is, how do you improve exercises? How would you have run these exercises? If you were running exercises in the 1920s and 30s for the major navies, what would be your ground rules? And I'd love to see the comments on that. What would be your ground rules for how these exercises are implemented? And how do you think they could best learn from them? Because that's a discussion I want to have. There's going to be, in a few years, I'm going to do probably a year of wargaming. Wargaming and exercises. Talking about exercises, talking about videos about different exercises and done by the Royal Navy, by the US Navy, by IJN, various navies throughout history, big exercise. And that's a year I would really like to do. But that's going to be a little while away as I bring together all the data, get all the books involved, and manage to get together things which I can talk about these exercises for. But the point is, before we get there, we need to have a discussion. I want to have a discussion about how the audience thinks these exercises should have been structured. How do you think the rules are? And how do you think the rules should have been applied? Myself, there's at least one person in the American exercises who I would have kicked out. I have another list of about 3 people from the Royal Navy who were kicked out. That's an interesting differential I sometimes draw between the two. And then you have the Japanese one where, realistically, they don't have people breaking the rules that way. They have people breaking the rules by setting the exercises, second exercise framing, so tightly. And if anyone shows anything which they don't, they kick it out. They kick it out. So they break it in a different way. I don't know. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for watching. Take care, and please do like, share, and subscribe if you like the video and want to see more.